Hello and welcome to Module 2. Module 2 covers chapters 1, 2, and 3 in the Cornell and Jacobson textbook. It's our first entry into new material for the course, and as such, I'm going to give you an overview of chapters 1, 2, and 3. This module will cover those overviews, where else you can find that information, and in addition to that, I will talk a little bit about the quizzes. I probably won't spend a long time talking about the quizzes every module introduction, but since this is our first, I think we'll maybe take a moment to look at it. So in chapter 1, we combine two important ideas. We're going to start very general and we're going to work our way to the specific this semester. So at first we want to talk about what is government. And that's a lot of what chapter 1 is. Chapter 1 talks about what we mean in various terms with American government and government worldwide. And we're going to look at a couple political science approaches to understanding government. In chapter 2, we begin to look at an historical approach to the U.S. Constitution. And we're going to start with the founding of the country, and we're going to work our way all the way to the document itself. And then in chapter 3, we're going to talk about a principle that underlies American government, which is federalism, this idea of the United States and the various state governments having shared responsibilities, but at the same time having independent responsibilities. So in chapter 1, we look at a idea that a lot of people use to understand political science called rational choice theory. You'll notice that the book's called The Logic of American Politics, and so it makes this strong claim that American politics is logical, that you can understand it using principles of logic, and while that might be debatable, later in the semester, we're going to talk more about a psychological approach. At times, we're going to say, "Hey, I don't know why they do this, but this is exactly how it works." But it's important as we move forward into the course to remember that the people who organized and founded the country actually were educated people. They might have had values different than what we have, but they knew how to cause certain events to occur through the institutional arrangements that they set up. And so the American Constitution was written for various purposes, but it was written on purpose. And a lot of political science is about understanding those purposes. And so we often look at psychological approaches, economic approaches. Rational choice is borrowed largely from economics, and historical approaches. So chapter 2 uses more of a historical approach. This happened, which led to this next thing, constantly with the founders trying to solve problems. Federalism is all about how they did not want to give up their power on the state level. So going back to chapter 1, rational choice theory has two main ideas. That people look at the world in terms of costs and benefits. They want to minimize costs while maximizing benefits. And two, sometimes you get different results when two people are competing or at least looking out for their own best interests than what you might get if somehow you could come up with a shared idea of what's best for everyone. And one of the great excuses for government is that sometimes government is able to coordinate activities in a way that allows more people to maximize their benefits, or if not maximize their benefits, get satisfactory benefits. Again, you're free to argue that isn't the way that it works in practice, but it's the reason why we have government at all. We'll be looking at several different games, as they call it in economics. A game is when you have two or more players, and each of the players, each of the individual actors, is trying to maximize their benefit. An idea called the collective action problem is any time when the interest of the group is different from the interest of the individuals. And so we study those collective action problems with these games by looking at two players. Each tries to do what's best for themselves, and then what happens. And so the examples of what we're going to look at was we're going to look at the prisoner's dilemma, the chicken game, the tragedy of the commons, and then maybe one where the stakes are a little lower called the coordination game. And each of these is useful for understanding, not because we are going to worry about being prisoners one day, or that we would be foolish enough to drive two cars together at high speed and hope that the other guy swerves out of the way, but because of how these work as analogies for real world problems, such as maybe you want to form an interest group and everybody wants that interest to succeed. But everybody knows that as long as enough other people are doing the work, they can focus on the things that benefit themselves. Think, for instance, of someone who wants to make sure that tuition stays low. Now, you could all write your member of the General Assembly and say, please keep tuition low. But that takes work, especially if you had to hand deliver it, if you had to lobby yourself. But if you could get other people to do it, then you could do the things like get good grades in your classes that benefit you, while other people are struggling, right? So that's overly specific maybe for an introduction like this, but we will talk about it in the slides. We're also going to talk about some key terms related to government. These are often things that you've been introduced to in high school or even before, like authoritarianism, democracy, republics, representative government, direct democracy. And in fact, there's a list of key terms at the end of chapter 1 that you can look at. They're also in boldface in the text. And if you look at those, this is probably the most number of key terms that you're going to have all semester. And I always recommend make sure that you're familiar with the key terms, because those are perfect. Define this key term is a great quiz question. So in chapter 2, we're going to look at the U.S. Constitution. Briefly we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence, we'll talk about the Articles of Confederation, but we're going to spend a great deal of time talking about what's actually in the U.S. Constitution. So there's 7 articles. Article 1 establishes the legislative branch, Article 2, the executive branch, Article 3, the judicial branch. But maybe you aren't even familiar with what Articles 4, 5, 6, and 7 cover. And so we're going to look at all of those. If you quizzed me on it, I could tell you. We're also going to look at the 27 amendments to the Constitution, maybe more attention to the first 10, which are called the Bill of Rights. And we'll have a lot more detail on the Bill of Rights in chapter 5 when we talk about civil liberties, because most of your civil liberties under the Constitution are listed in the Bill of Rights. Kind of confusing, right? Civil rights are in the 14th Amendment and laws that Congress passes. Civil liberties are in the Bill of Rights. That's because the terminology wasn't as set in stone back in the 1780s and 90s the way it is today. And they took the name Bill of Rights from a document in the 1680s in Great Britain. So there was the English Bill of Rights, and there's the United States Bill of Rights. Although, in fact, it's just the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that have come to be called that. But we'll also have other provisions in the Constitution, other amendments that we'll talk about this semester as well. And then in Chapter 3, we talk about federalism. And one of the interesting things about federalism is that the U.S. Constitution doesn't talk about federalism very much at all. The 10th Amendment does say that all powers not granted to the United States under the Constitution or prohibited to the states are reserved to the states and to the people. And so that's kind of a complicated idea if you think about it, because, well, the U.S. Constitution doesn't mention everything that a government would do. And in practice, over 200 years, the Constitution was ratified in 1789. Well, it went into effect in 1789. It was a couple-year process of getting it ratified. Even though it went into effect way back then, it would be interesting to see, and we will see, that there's been a dramatic change in its meaning over the course of these, 230 years. And so what will that look like? Well, for one thing, we're going to look at concepts like centralization. Two, we're going to look at constitutional amendments. I say the 10th Amendment reserves powers to the states, but if you look at the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment does not actually grant any powers whatsoever to the states, but it does give Congress the power to enforce civil rights, and most specifically, privileges and immunities, due process, and equal protection under the law. And that's a lot. A lot of what government does is guarantee those things. And so when you say government's responsible for equal protection, when you say they say that people's life, liberty, and property cannot be taken from them without the due process of law, well, all of a sudden, you're looking at a lot of the activity of government. So that gets stripped away from the states in the 14th Amendment and given to the national government. And so we'll look at that in good detail in Chapter 4, which is about civil rights. So in addition to that, just the practice over time, the ability of the U.S. government to borrow incredible sums of money while states cannot, the power of the U.S. government to create money while the states cannot, have always tended toward increasing the power of the national government. And so we're going to spend an entire chapter discussing this transfer. It's not an accident that in 1787, when the Constitution was proposed by the Constitutional Convention, that the people who were in favor of it were called Federalists, because they were in favor of increasing the size of the national government from what had existed before. And now, people who call themselves Federalists are usually in favor of limiting the power of the national government. So we've gone from a country that wasn't quite a federal republic to one that isn't quite, but one that wasn't quite up to the strength of government that you would expect a national government to be in a modern federal republic. And now we live in a world where maybe the U.S. government's a little more powerful than the state governments are, perhaps much more powerful. So when you're finished with looking at those voiceovers, once you've looked through the chapters, and especially once you've familiarized yourself with the key terms, you're going to be able to work on the graded assignments. And actually, I strongly encourage you to look at the discussion right away. The discussion is available already. Well, as you look at this, in my world, where I'm recording this video before the first day that the module is open, It's in the future, but you're looking at it. You can go and you can actually work on the first, well, it's actually discussion number 2, right? Your personal introduction was discussion number 1. And so what you'll do is you'll watch the video on the prisoner's dilemma, and then after you do that, you will react to it. There's a prompt. I strongly encourage that you read the prompt carefully. Maybe you read the prompt before you watch the video so that you can take some notes. It's a short video. Once it's over, though, you're going to apply the concepts that the professor is introducing to you there, and then you will write a brief discussion of it, and you'll respond to somebody else's discussion. And you can do this anytime while the module's open. During the last 3 days of the module, however, you'll have the opportunity to take the quiz. And so your first content quiz is going to cover chapters 1, 2, and 3. It's going to be 20 questions long, and you're going to have 30 minutes to complete it. It's going to be multiple choice, and it's going to be open book and open note. So 30 minutes, so you better not be taking more than, say, 2 minutes per question, right? Or you're going to slightly fall behind. I guess if you've answered 10 because you knew them, and then you have another 10 that you have to look up, you'll probably have plenty of time. But if you don't know any of the material, there's not enough time to look up every question. So you'll complete those. There should be at least 6 questions from every chapter. However, 2 of the chapters will have 7 questions. It'll be a total of 20 questions. And in past semesters, when it was a 25-question test, a vast majority of the students managed to finish in about 25 minutes, about 1 minute per question. Because that's too close to the border of what's an exam and what's a quiz, so I decided to back that off to just 20 questions this semester. Because of that, I would expect that most students would be able to complete all of the questions within 20 minutes if you are familiar with the questions. Those extra 10 minutes are, for trying to figure it out if you're having a bit of trouble. Four possible answers, you'll pick the best one, and generally speaking, students do pretty well. The quizzes go well. There's one final exam, and we're going to have to take a little bit more time to study for the final exam at the end, but I think you'll be fine with this quiz, so long as you're familiar with the material, and so long as you take it seriously. There's always a student who says, I thought it was going to be very easy. It's not very easy, but the opportunity to succeed is definitely there for every one of you. I would be surprised. Well, I will not give a score guess because everyone will read that in and they'll say, hey, I'll do an average amount of work. I can't promise you it's an average amount of work for you. I'm promising you that the average student ends up pretty happy with the scores they get. So if anybody has any questions for me, I strongly encourage you to ask them. You can send them to my campus email address, and I'll try to get back to you as quick as possible. If you ask a question that helps the class, I will consider giving you a bonus point for it. I will answer your question to you, of course, but I might also answer the question in the announcements so that students can all learn from your good question. I figure most of the time if somebody asks a question, they're asking it for many people, not just for themselves. And it's not what I write, but what you understand from any directions, and I want to make sure that you all are able to understand. So good luck, everyone, and I will be in touch again soon.